Star Wars has become a cultural touchstone. The myth now influences itself. Generations have grown up with Star Wars as part of the cultural fabric. It's grown beyond its initial influence to the point that the Empire, a caricature of Nazi Germany, is itself caricatured in the First Order of the Disney-era Star Wars films. The original film spawned several assumptions and misinterpretations that were later folded into the mythos as canon. And that's just the start of the cultural mutations by and to Star Wars over the last half-century. Today, millions of people, including many watching this, grew up with the Star Wars saga as part of the cultural furniture, something that was just always there. But looking at how it evolved sheds some light on how mythologies grow and spread through a culture, and it makes us consider the question of who really owns a culture's myths. This is the original Star Wars title crawl. No Episode 4, no New Hope, just Star Wars. While George Lucas had the broad strokes of the saga worked out, and Star Wars deliberately invokes the style of the old Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers serials, it was made as a standalone film. Let's look at it from that standpoint. The original Star Wars establishes a world with a history and with rules. Much has been made over the years about how later films discard the implied history, much of it pertaining to things Obi-Wan said in the first film.
He was the best star pilot in the galaxy, and a cunning warrior.
But more subtly, the implied limitations. For example, in the film, there appears to be no faster-than-light communication aside from getting on a ship, flying across the galaxy, and talking to someone. The rebels put the Death Star plans in a droid and fly away with it instead of broadcasting the plans to their leadership or posting them to the galactic equivalent of WikiLeaks. Less overt, we never see anyone carrying on a conversation across interstellar space in that film. Obi-Wan doesn't call ahead to Alderaan to let them know he's coming. Han doesn't contact anyone to file a flight plan or apply for an entry visa. Presumably, no one ever does. The Empire Strikes Back rather clumsily breaks with this in order to have Vader talk to the Emperor, thereby introducing a potentially world-breaking element that was then absorbed into the assumptions of the wider Star Wars lore until, in current iterations, people have transgalactic chats all the time. That initial impression of a lack of instantaneous communications across interstellar space is further supported by Obi-Wan. The locals all know where he lives, and he's still using the name Kenobi.
I thought he might have meant old Ben.
He seems more like an eccentric retiree than a fugitive.
What if he's related to Ben?
That wizard's just a crazy old man.
There's no galaxy-wide most wanted hotline, and with the Jedi defunct as an institution, there's little reason for locals to care about an old Jedi living the hermit life in the boonies. One might also argue that he's even still wearing his Jedi robes, but that would be a misreading. At this point, there was no Jedi lore beyond what the movie tells us. Obi-Wan was dressed in environment-appropriate attire, loose-fitting garments and light fabrics and a desert palette. Luke and Uncle Owen dress very similarly. It's working-class desert casual. Return of the Jedi implies a very different look for traditional Jedi clothing. Luke's outfit perfectly fits the mythos of the Jedi established up to that point, a fusion between a cop and a priest. This was my childhood idea of what a Jedi was. Severe, calm, and kinda scary, like there's a switch in their head that can go from friendly pastor to full Spec Ops kill you all in a heartbeat. After Return of the Jedi in 1983, there were no Star Wars movies until 1999. But there was the expanded universe. Comics, novels starting with Timothy Zahn's excellent Thrawn trilogy, games from LucasArts that let you pilot an X-Wing against the evil Empire or a TIE fighter against those rebel scum. During this time, we start to see the Jedi depicted wearing clothing very much like Obi-Wan's desert hobo robes, regardless of the environment. Games like Dark Forces 2 and Knights of the Old Republic really created the idea of the Jedi as warrior monks clad in long-sleeved gis and overrobes. This was done by people interpreting the mythology that George Lucas had created. The robed Jedi was then adopted by Lucas and formalized with the Phantom Menace. Henceforth, Jedi always wear Tatooine-style desert attire, suitably refined with hints of traditional Japanese samurai style. Whether they're sitting in a meeting, fighting in a forest, or getting fragged by their own men on a chilly overpass, the myth changed in the telling. The story was picked up by others who added their own interpretation. The fandom built on it with Jedi cosplay, and that collectively assembled image of the robed Jedi Knight in turn influenced the myth's creator as he built on it. While we're on the subject of the prequels, we have to talk a little bit about Anakin Skywalker. Again, back to the original, all we knew is what Obi-Wan told us.
A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father.
As pretty much everyone in the English-speaking world now knows, The Empire Strikes Back revealed that Vader is Luke's father, a revelation that Obi-Wan later squirms out of with some cable news level bullshit.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
Point being, the original trilogy gives an impression of Anakin as a military officer, a father, a flawed individual in a difficult time. A grown-ass man, you might say. The prequels infantilize Anakin Skywalker, first by turning him into a little kid when he first meets Obi-Wan, and later by having him react in childish ways to the world around him.
He's overly critical. He never listens. He doesn't understand. It's not fair.
He whines, he mopes, he slips into fits of rage over imagined slights.
You turned her against me!
He's uninspiring and easily manipulated. In many ways, he's a harbinger of the kind of overly emotional, uninformed cancel culture twaddlers that make up so much of today's media ecosystem, in which cry-bullying is treated as legitimate instead of just the childish whining of entitled morons. Anakin Skywalker should be viewed as a cautionary tale. He's exactly the kind of person that can become a Darth Vader. The lack of empathy coupled with a sense of inadequacy that can lead to immense cruelty rationalized as doing the right thing. The character is insufferable and his motivations are simplistic and irrational, but that reflected something that was just starting to metastasize through American culture at the start of the 21st century. But the prequels also reach backward in a deliberate but subtle back to the good old days kind of reflection. While Star Wars took place mostly in the mechanical world of the Imperial fleet or the dirty, worn-out settings of Tatooine, Episode 1 sets much of its story on Naboo, a lush world that seems like a glorified representation of Renaissance Italy. It's warm and welcoming without being quaint or homely. It's a clean pastoral society with elaborate fashion and artisanal spacecraft. Everything is flowing, there's an artistry to it all. Until industrialization intrudes on it. First with the battle droids of the Trade Federation, which could be used as a great bit of neo-Marxist social commentary. The Clone Wars bring the same theme to a galaxy-wide crescendo, vast military-industrial complexes churning out armies of identical droids and identical clones to throw at each other, all manipulated by a few plutocrats for their own gain. And at the end of it, the Republic's victory means the preservation of its territory at the expense of its principles. At the time Revenge of the Sith was released, there were a lot of comparisons between Palpatine's Empire and George W. Bush's America. And with the onset of seemingly endless wars and the Patriot Act, the comparisons weren't without merit. But today we can see that it goes much deeper. As the post-Return of the Jedi expanded universe tells, even with the Emperor dead and gone, the Empire's evil persists. It's not a man, but a dark force that drives it. A system and a mindset. Enter Disney. When the mouse acquired Star Wars, all that expanded universe stuff was decanonized. Glorified fanfiction. They wanted a clean slate to tell new stories, or more accurately, they wanted an excuse to salad bar the source material, take what they wanted in the combo they preferred, and leave the rest sitting there on the tray. A decision that much of the fan base vehemently disagreed with. Which brings up the question of the ownership of myths. In the ancient world, all the great mythology began with someone making up a story. The Epic of Gilgamesh didn't always exist, someone wrote it. Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, the stories of the Mahabharata or the Bible. These stories resonated with people who retold them. Some pilfered them into their own stories, spreading them until they were so well known that they became cultural touchstones. Myths are part of how we see our world. They're stories that are part of who we are. But modern myths are also copyrighted products. Star Wars is a prime example of modern mythology. We can make reference to its major characters, call a disliked supervisor Darth Vader, or refer to someone turning to the dark side, and it's universally understood within our culture, even by people who aren't Star Wars fans and may have never even seen any of the movies. As mythology, it's public. It's become part of the public consciousness, part of the language. It's part of our collective culture. But it's also an IP owned by a big corporation. Disney didn't create Star Wars, the best they can do is badly retell it, but they can use copyright law to jealously guard their control of it, to be the gatekeepers of how the mythology is told. And because of that, we have this huge decanonized body of work in the Star Wars novels, comics, and games that built on the story George Lucas told, other people telling new stories, expanding the mythology in ways that respected it and resonated with millions of people. Disney says, no, that's not canon anymore. That's not the true mythos. We'll still sell it to you, but our stories are the real Star Wars now. And the fans, or more to the point, the people to whom this mythology was important because the stories spoke to them on a level deeper than mere entertainment, reject this rehashing of their stories. How would devout Catholics react if the Pope announced that the Gospels were no longer canon, but here's some new stories you'll like? It sounds like a wacky comparison because we conflate the stories with religious belief, but on their own they're just stories, and they serve the same function that all good stories do. They tell us something about ourselves, our world, and how we can best deal with it through a narrative that is somehow separated from our everyday lives. Stories do this in a way that political ideologies, religious doctrines, and logical arguments can't. This is what the level of mythology is like. It's not that people believe the stories, only that the stories are important to them. They say something relevant to them and become a reference point in a chaotic world. People take comfort and guidance from their stories, and whether those stories are collected in the Bible, or the Lord of the Rings, or the Star Wars films, makes very little practical difference in how it impacts an individual's life. I think this, more than any other factor, is why the backlash against Disney's handling of Star Wars has been so harsh in some cases. The Force Awakens is sort of the club remix of Star Wars. Same basic beats, but flashier, louder, more commercial, and less memorable. As though someone made a musical of the Odyssey. It might amuse us, but it's not going to make anyone think too deeply about war and society. The new villains, the First Order, are a cartoonish rehash of the Galactic Empire, and this is one of the interesting elements of a myth changing in the retelling. The First Order is almost Star Wars spoofing itself. It's a Disneyfication of Nazism, turning the evil archetype into a bunch of ill-intentioned buffoons, shouting maniacally and stumbling over themselves.
This is Hux. You and your friends are doomed. We will wipe your filth from the galaxy.
Okay, I'll hold.
Hello?
Hello? Yep, I'm still here.
The villains have been transformed from an echo of a tyranny that might well have triumphed to clowns played up for comic relief. And the New Republic, hopeful but struggling in the old stories, is now portrayed as inept and corrupt, the rotten product of a pointless war. They deconstruct and destroy characters that people loved, turning Han Solo and Luke Skywalker into lonely old failures instead of men rising above their flaws to be the best they can be because people are depending on them.
You're Han Solo!
I used to be.
Expanded universe characters like Mara Jade, the obvious choice for a studio looking to bring a strong female character to the screen in a Star Wars continuation, was discarded entirely, and instead we get Mary Sues and inept shrews. Of course the fans don't like these characters. And while the studio will blame racism and misogyny and toxic fans, nobody likes Rose Tico. I don't, my wife doesn't, and it has nothing to do with sexism or Kelly Marie Tran being Asian. She did as well as anyone could playing such a badly written character who seems to exist only to berate Finn and deprive him of his one heroic act. The fault here is Rian Johnson's. Yes, I'm blaming the white guy. Of course, it is just movies, and from that standpoint, the loud, thin slice of fandom that lives to complain about it seems a little ridiculous. But we have to recognize that they have an audience because a myth isn't just a product. It's part of the culture, our culture. And while a corporation may own the legal rights to the intellectual property, that doesn't change the cultural reality that the stories belong to all of us, and nobody likes having their stories turned into a joke. Okay, so I've turned down the render distance. Is your frame rate good?